Hello everyone, it's Greg from Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy here with another historical fencing themed video. Today is going to be part one of a two-part presentation on the early history of the Italian fencing traditions. In this first part, we're going to look at the transition from a medieval style of swordsmanship into a Renaissance style of swordsmanship. I'd just like to quickly note that these terms, medieval and Renaissance, can be difficult to define very precisely, and they do tend to mean different things to different people. From a wider cultural perspective, the Renaissance really began in the middle of the 15th century in Italy. However, in fencing terms, in my opinion anyway, swordsmanship remained medieval until the early 1500s in Italy, and it's only around about 1520 or 1530 that we have evidence for something that's definitively different and Renaissance. So we're going to explore that idea in the rest of this video. Okay, so to perform this analysis of the medieval to Renaissance transition, we're going to consider four Italian fencing masters, two medieval and two Renaissance. Representing the medieval tradition, we have Fiore de' Liberi, who published his works in the very early 1400s, and also Filippo Vadi, who published his works in the 1480s, at the other end of the 15th century. Representing the Renaissance, we have Antonio Manciolino and Achille Marozzo, who both published books, influential books, in the 1530s. So we're going to see clear differences, but also similarities between these two groups of fencing masters. In order to analyse their characteristics, we're going to look at the equipment represented within these books. We'll very briefly summarise the most important tactical doctrines which these masters were teaching, and finally we'll consider who their target audience was, so who was reading these fencing treatises and who was actually training in these styles of swordsmanship. Okay, so let's get started with our analysis of the medieval tradition. So in the books of both Fiore and Vadi, the principal weapon, the principal sword which the fencers are using was something like this, which is a medieval style of two-handed sword. So we can see a simple cross-hilted guard, a long handle to facilitate a two-handed grip on the weapon, and a relatively broad flat blade suitable for cutting and thrusting. In Italian, this weapon is known as a spada a due mani, which would literally translate to a two-handed sword. Many modern researchers refer to such weapons as long swords. In fact, this is a medieval German term. It's just a translation of Langschwert. So when we're talking about Italian fencing, the term two-handed sword is actually more appropriate, and therefore I'll use that one in this video. Alongside the two-handed sword, these books also spend a reasonable amount of space explaining the use of the spear or lance and the poleaxe. There's also quite a lot of information about the use of the rondel dagger, which is a thrusting dagger, and this is integrated with a lot of wrestling moves. These weapons are shown in armour sometimes, and sometimes in civilian clothes. So that's the equipment from the medieval books. Let's talk now about some of the tactical doctrines of the style of swordsmanship. So the first interesting tactical point to note is that the medieval styles used a large variety of guard stances to fence from. These often had fanciful names. In this example page from Vadi's treatise, we can see the Guard of the Iron Door, the Falcon's Guard, the Archer's Guard, and the Short Extended Guard, for example. However, there were quite a few of these. Vadi had 12, Fiore a comparable number, and there were other different guards to be learned for the spear and the poleaxe and the dagger and so on. So these guards presented a wide variety of tactical options when you started a fencing bout. The next tactical thing to note is that these systems were cut and thrust systems, as can be clearly seen here in this page from Fiore's treatise, with two fencers threatening each other with the edges of their swords on the left and a thrust being delivered with the tip on the right. So in the medieval style, these attacks were used with equal weight and equal merit, shall we say. The last key tactical doctrine that we'll examine briefly here is the idea that in medieval fencing, wrestling or grappling and the actual swordsmanship were completely integrated together. So in this page from Vadi's book, we can see two armoured fencers engaged in a couple of different grappling moves while using two-handed swords. So there wasn't really a huge distinction between fencing and wrestling. The two merged and overlapped, and fencers had to be able to move from one style of fighting into the other at an instant's notice in a fight. So to complete our analysis of the medieval approach to swordsmanship, we have to analyse who exactly was studying this martial art and who was reading or buying these fencing treatises. The answer is illustrated quite nicely here in this wonderful diagram from Fiore's book. So these systems were aimed at knights, or the knightly classes. So they were martial arts for elite feudal warriors. This is made clear in Fiore's writings, where he lists a fairly extensive number of knights and squires who he has trained in his martial art. While in Vadi's book, he specifies that this art was intended for the nobility, mentioning dukes, princes, barons, and kings of the land. He says that readers should take care to keep it out of the hands of the ignorant lower orders who are not suited to learning this sort of stuff. And he finally goes on to say that people should be using their fencing skills to do things like protect widows and orphans, because this is a pious deed. So this is very clearly a chivalric idea of these combat systems. So they were martial arts for elite feudal warriors. Right, so let's now turn our attention to the Renaissance and the later masters Manciolino and Marozzo. So we'll start with the equipment and weapons from their books. So for these two masters, the main principal weapon which their fencers trained with was something like this. So this is a single-handed sword. You can see the short handle. It has a cross guard, but also some extra pieces of protection for the hand, so finger rings and side rings to reduce the chance of hand injury when fencing. The blade of the weapon is a cut and thrust blade. It's still relatively broad and flat, although obviously not quite as broad as for the two-handed sword. It should be noted that the blade also had a bit more of a taper to produce a narrower point for better penetration on the thrust. This type of sword didn't have a particular name back in the day. It was just referred to in the books as a spada, meaning a sword. Modern researchers have come up with this phrase, this spada da lato, which translates to side sword, to try to classify this weapon. The name comes from the idea that it was commonly worn at the side as a sidearm. However, this is not a period term, it was just a sword to the fencers of the 16th century. Alongside this cut and thrust sword, these treatises do describe other weapons as well, but these are a little different from the medieval books. So now the two-handed sword has been relegated to really a secondary position in these books. The Renaissance two-handed sword was also larger and heavier than its medieval ancestor. The hafted weapons have also changed form by this period as well. So the chivalric lance and poleaxe have been discarded in the favour of pole arms such as halberds, bills and partisans. So these were originally, at any rate, the weapons of the common foot soldier rather than the knight. We should finally note that the fencers in these books are all portrayed in civilian clothes. There are no longer pictures of people wearing full armour. That doesn't necessarily mean that the techniques were not applicable to a military situation. However, they're being presented in quite a different way. And one final brief note is to say that the use of companion weapons in the offhand was quite prominent in these books. So fencers could use their single-handed sword now in conjunction with a variety of shields or a dagger for parrying in the left hand. So the dagger has also changed form. It's now more for parrying than for wrestling and thrusting. So now let's briefly summarise some of the tactical approaches of the Renaissance masters and compare them with the medieval equivalents. We'll start with the guard stances. Here we can see an example page from one of the several editions of Marozzo's treatise. So yeah, once again, we can see that there were a wide variety of guard postures which the fencer had to learn, and they all had their own different tactical applications during a fight. So the specific guard stances were by no means identical to the earlier medieval masters, but the general idea was the same. So there were a large number of guards for the fencers to remember. The medieval systems, as we discussed, were cut and thrust systems of swordsmanship. The Renaissance systems were exactly the same. Here we can see another of Marozzo's fencers preparing a powerful cutting attack with his single-handed sword. But of course, thrusts were equally important in these systems as well. So no change from the medieval period there. Then finally, there is wrestling and grappling to talk about. So in the medieval systems, the fencing and wrestling was completely integrated, but now we do see a big change. So there were wrestling moves within the Renaissance systems, but they had been completely separated out, more or less, from the swordsmanship. And were taught as a separate series of actions. Here we can see another Marozzo diagram showing two fencers grappling, one of them completely unarmed, the other armed only with a dagger or knife. I should just quickly explain here that Manciolino did not have any diagrams accompanying his text, but his ideas were very similar to Marozzo's. So we now have to consider the Renaissance fencers themselves. So who exactly was studying fencing in the early 1500s, and who were the fencing masters aiming their treatises and their lessons at? So the answer is actually quite different from the medieval period. Both Marozzo and Manciolino do mention, to a certain extent, kings and princes and the nobility of the art in their books. However, they also talk about certain interesting practical things, such as taking money for their lessons, the rules for holding competitive bouts in public, and in general how a fencing school should operate. So that's an important fact to note. These masters were teaching fencing at commercial schools, which were open to the public. So these techniques were aimed at people who could afford such lessons, in other words, urban gentlemen. And this picture plate from one of Marozzo's editions shows quite clearly the sort of people we're talking about. Three finely dressed gentlemen in civilian clothes, but with their swords and other weapons to hand. So in the early 1500s, the Renaissance style of fencing had changed from being a martial art for a feudal warrior to a martial art for an urban gentleman. So now it's time to try to draw some conclusions from all of this. What exactly happened during this transition from a medieval tradition of swordsmanship to a Renaissance tradition in Italy? The answer is that some things changed and some things remained the same. So the constants were the idea that it was a multi-weapon, multidisciplinary art, that the learning of a wide variety of complex guard stances was necessary to approach a fight because it gave you lots of different options and approaches to take. And also it was a cut and thrust system. So cuts and thrusts as attacks were considered to be equally valid and equally important throughout the medieval and into the early Renaissance period. However, we can also see some notable changes. The sorts of equipment being used changed, and this went hand in hand with the change in target market for fencing lessons. While in the medieval period, swordsmanship was focused on chivalric knights, in other words on feudal warriors, and the sorts of equipment they would use, heavy armour, lances, poleaxes, two-handed swords and so on. In the Renaissance period, it focused a lot more on urban gentlemen who were paying for lessons at commercial fencing schools, and they were using simple sidearm style swords alongside the polearms and later style two-handed swords that came from the common foot soldiers rather than from the chivalric knights. So we see a change in context from this old feudal martial art to a new urban gentleman's martial art. However, many of the tactical principles actually remain the same, albeit applied with different weapons. So that's it for today's video. I will return shortly with part 2 of this presentation, where we'll look at some further changes that happened within the later Renaissance period and how that eventually led Italian fencing to evolve into a new Baroque style in the 17th century. But for now, that's it. Take care everyone. See you soon.